Too much money at a young age can be a damaging thing, especially when you're in the world of professional sports, where you can almost live in a different reality perpendicular to the real world. Because of this, it's important for young athletes to keep themselves humble and focus on the game above all else. But what happens when your organization allows you to get away with almost anything, and isn't there to say no to the many excesses that can be attractive to someone young and wealthy? That's what we're going to find out when we look at the sad and hilarious legacy of Marvin Barnes, a Hall of Fame level talent who started his career in the mid-70s but was out of the NBA before he was 28 years old due to drug problems, a disdain for practice, and a strange fear of time machines. This is the story of the wackiest player in basketball history. Marvin Barnes was born in Providence, Rhode Island on July 27, 1952. He and his two other siblings had a turbulent upbringing, constantly having to see their father, Al, beat their mother, Lula, for offenses as minor as forgetting to buy green beans for a Thanksgiving dinner. Al's wrath also extended to the kids, with Marvin developing severe night terrors as a result of the constant verbal and physical abuse. Al was also not the most faithful of husbands. In fact, he would enlist Marvin to help him cheat on other women. When a husband in the same apartment complex would leave for the day, Al would have Marvin wait outside the building while he would get it on with the wife of said husband. Then, when the man returned home for the day, Marvin would run inside and sound the alarm for his father, who would then sometimes have to escape down the fire escape without his pants, or launch himself out through an open window. Eventually, several of the men in the building caught wind of what Al was doing, and weren't too happy, as you might expect. So Al temporarily abandoned his family to escape vigilante justice. Marvin enjoyed watching gangster films of the 1930s as a child, and began to look up to famous American criminals such as Al Capone, Babyface Nelson, and Bonnie and Clyde. They were his personal heroes. Unable to find work as a teenager, Marvin and 5 friends from his neighborhood began to burglarize multiple stores to earn money. When he was 16 years old, Marvin also bought a .22 caliber pistol from an ex-convict he used to play pickup basketball games with. One night, after his father started singing a parody version of a Sam Cooke song about how Marvin would get a beating after dinner, like some sort of sadistic version of Weird Al Yankovic, Marvin pulled out the gun and pointed it at his father. As you might expect, Al's casual beatings stopped then and there. In his junior year, Marvin shot up to 6'3" in height, finally giving him the confidence he needed to try out for his Central High School basketball team. While not exactly skilled on the offensive end, Barnes was a standout defender. He also served as the team's enforcer, causing bench-clearing brawls and even taking pride in the fact that he was ejected from his first 4 varsity games ever played. He was eventually promoted to the starting lineup as he continued to grow a couple more inches over the next few months, and thanks to his contributions, Central High School went undefeated and won the Class A title state game. To celebrate, Marvin got together with his criminal gang and decided to rob 3 stagecoach buses in a series of stick-up operations that took place over a single hour. The only problem was, Marvin, a 6'5" black kid in Rhode Island, decided to wear his varsity jacket with his own name embroidered on it while committing the crimes. So yeah, the cops arrested Barnes a mere 15 minutes after the robberies occurred, and locked him up at the local station. What was the grand sum of the heist, you ask? $43. A real gold mine. No matter, because Marvin went on to have an impressive career at Providence College. After blossoming to 6'8", he sharpened his skills as an offensive player, thanks in part to the Friars point guard and Marvin's new friend, Ernie DiGregorio, who was an incredibly skilled ball handler and a passing wizard. He made arguably the greatest college pass of all time. Check it out here. But the 1973 season got off to quite a rocky start for the Friars. On October 9, 1972, 6 players on the varsity team walked into the office of head coach Dave Gavitt and demanded he ban Larry Ketvertis from practices. Ketvertis was a 6'10" center for the Friars, who didn't have the numbers of Ernie or Marvin, but he sure packed a heck of a punch, and he brought that same rough-and-tumble style of play to team scrimmages. And after a number of black eyes, broken noses, and various other assortments of injuries, his teammates had it. Gavitt, however, denied their request. But 10 days later, on October 19th, during a 4-on-4 scrimmage, Marvin and Ketvertis were matched up against each other, and at one point, Larry threw an elbow in Marvin's mouth, knocking 2 of his front teeth so loose that they nearly fell out of his mouth. After going to the dentist, Marvin then returned to the campus's cafeteria where Larry was eating. Marvin motioned for him to come outside, and, as the story goes, Marvin sucker punched Larry and then retrieved a tire iron he had stashed in a nearby bush to hit Larry again, although Barnes claimed he never used a tire iron, only his fist. What we know for sure is that Ketvertus had a fractured cheekbone, he claimed that his eyeball was dangling out of its socket, and he had to undergo surgery. What's ironic about this situation is that the only player who didn't want Ketvertus kicked from the team at the start of the season was, oddly enough, Marvin, who knew that losing Larry meant that he'd have to be promoted to center rather than his preferred position of power forward. In the aftermath, Marvin was placed on probation, but he was still allowed to play basketball for the school. Despite this incident, Barnes was a highly coveted prospect after a stellar senior season where he led the nation in rebounding and scored 52 points in a game against Austin Peay on December 15, 1973, setting a Providence record for single-game scoring. He was of special interest to the Spirits of St. Louis, a new ABA team formed out of the little that remained of the Carolina Cougars. The Spirits were headed by a group of New York businessmen who had wanted to buy the Detroit Pistons in 1973, but negotiations ultimately fell through. The Spirits were bringing pro basketball back to St. Louis for the first time in 6 years, after the St. Louis Hawks had relocated to Atlanta, and like any young team, they were desperate to make a name for themselves. Philadelphia had drafted Barnes second overall in the 1974 NBA draft, and the Denver Nuggets held the rights to Marvin in the ABA. But the Spirits cut a deal with the Nuggets and offered Barnes $2.1 million over 14 years if he signed to play in St. Louis. There had always been a rivalry between the NBA and ABA when it came to drafting college players, but never before had the ABA been able to pull a top 3 draft pick over to their side before. And what a draft choice Barnes, or as he called himself, News, turned out to be. From the very beginning, the ABA was seen as a wackier brother-in-law to the NBA, and no team better personified that wackiness than the 1974-75 Spirits of St. Louis. That's not to say the team didn't have talent, far from it, but if you look at the team's personnel from management all the way down to the 18 players who were given a roster spot that year, 12 of which had only played 3 seasons or less, the team just reeked of inexperience. This is the type of team that holds a special promotion night for kids, sponsored by the restaurant Burger Chef and hosted by such adorable mascots like Burger Chef and Jeff.
Terrified tomatoes, Count Bangburger!
Burger Chef, I have come to cast my evil eye upon your happy place.
What'll we do, Burger Chef?
We'll give him my delicious burger and fries. Thanks a lot. I'm happy. What you going to get at Burger Chef?
And when Burger Chef and Jeff do chin-ups on one of the arena rims to make the kids laugh, team owner Harry Weltman comes running onto the court, yelling at Burger Chef and Jeff about how they dented the team's rim, in front of all the little kids, effectively ruining promotion night. The type of team that holds a competition at halftime every single game for a lucky fan to get a paid trip around the world, sponsored by a travel agency. All they have to do is make a half-court shot. And lo and behold, when one fan did end up making the shot, the franchise was a mere few days away from going out of business. A team that announces 808 fans in attendance for a home game against the San Antonio Spurs, when in reality, a 22-year-old Bob Costas working his first ever broadcasting job counts only around 500 fans actually in attendance. And when he brings this fact up to the Spirits PR team, one of the guys gets angry at him and says that the missing 300 people are all in the bathroom, together, at one time. Speaking of Bob Costas, the only reason he got this job is by taking an old tape he had recorded in college, cut and spliced it except for 10 somewhat exciting calls,
pitch shifted his voice down to make him seem a lot older than he actually was,
and submitted that as his audition tape for the Spirits. He was a young, fun kid. The keyword being kid, because in a game against the Utah Stars at home, live on air, Costas uttered the infamous line, "Bill, it would seem that the Spirits have this one well in hand, but you can bet that the last thing Coach Bob McKinnon wants to see is a repeat of Friday night's blowjob." Yes, he actually said that on air. According to Spirits general manager Rudy Martzke, there was a saying that went around the ABA. Before you drop a player off at the city dump, call St. Louis. Maybe they'll take him. That's what happened with Steve Snapper Jones, a 3-time All-Star who had been in the ABA since the inaugural 67-68 season. At 32 years old, Steve had finally cracked the code on how to play winning basketball, but unfortunately for him, his body just began to break down. He was still able to be productive, able to chip in 10 points off the bench, but having to constantly see his younger teammates act aloof was torture for him. teammates like James Fly Williams, a streetball legend from New York City. Fly was eccentric, to say the least, if you couldn't already tell from the fact that he named himself after Curtis Fly Mayfield. Back when he was recruited by Austin Peay as a teenager, the story goes that Fly bought a plane ticket to Austin, Texas, and once he landed in the airport, he proceeded to ask people, "Hey man, where the P at?" completely unaware of the fact that Austin Peay is in Clarksville, Tennessee, not Texas. When his coach tried to explain this fact to him over the phone, Fly abruptly hung up, flew back to New York to call the coach again, and then he flew to Tennessee. When he finally did play for the school, he was known more for doing ridiculous stunts than he was his actual ability. Stunts like sitting up in the rafters to watch a game he was supposed to be playing in, or dribbling the ball off the court to go get a drink of water during an active game. The Spirit's first ever head coach, Bob McKinnon, recalled that the first time he ever saw Fly was in the NCAA tournament. This was when McKinnon was still working as an assistant coach for the Buffalo Braves in the NBA, so he was trying to scout some talent for the draft. According to McKinnon, Fly clanked an open corner shot and screamed at the top of his lungs that he got fouled. But when the ref chose to let the game go on, Fly decided to lay down on the court as the teams were still playing, as some sort of protest, I guess. McKinnon leaned over to some people he was sitting with and said, "I don't know who will draft, but it won't be that guy." In a cruel twist of fate, when McKinnon arrived in St. Louis for his first day as Spirit's head coach, Fly was waiting for him with open arms. It's fun to joke about, but Fly still had talent, as evidenced by his 29.4 points and 7.6 rebounds as a freshman, which he averaged while having little to no upper body strength. As the youngest child of 6 in a poor family, Fly grew up eating bad, which led to him having missing teeth and overall poor dental hygiene as an adult. Since he couldn't eat right, he was skinny as a rail. Thinking something had to be done, Spirit's owner Harry Weltman booked Fly an appointment at the dentist for him to get some teeth. And as Fly sat in the dentist chair, listening to the dentist explain how the procedure would work, the man pulled out a big needle for a Novocaine shot. Fly immediately ran out of the dentist's office, like a cartoon. When Harry Weltman caught wind of what happened, he called Fly and asked, "What's going on? You've got to have some teeth." Fly responded by saying, "Man, I wouldn't be the Fly if I had teeth." But Fly was a drop in the bucket compared to Marvin Barnes, whose first 2 years with the Spirits can almost serve as a guideline for everything you're not supposed to do as a pro athlete. From the very start, Barnes was chronically late to almost anything Spirits related. Practices, team meetings, flights, community events, sometimes games. Rather than working, he preferred to stay out and party hardy, to use one of his catchphrases, then sleep in most of the next day regardless of any obligation he had made the previous day. On several occasions, Marvin would show up to a game only a few minutes before tip-off and eat his entire dinner as trainers frantically hurried to tape him up so he could play. And I do mean a dinner. Steak and gravy, black-eyed peas, greens, mashed potatoes, or sometimes he would just bring in bags of greasy McDonald's burgers. And as he was being taped up, he would usually ask the ball boys to get him multiple tickets for girls he had invited to the game, as well as body lotion. Yeah, that was another one of his pre-game rituals. Marvin loved to stand in front of a mirror, naked, and watch as he rubbed body lotion all over himself. One time, he had a conversation with Bob Costas while he was doing this body lotion ritual. After it was over, Marvin turned to look at himself and said, quote, "Yeah, I've always had the bitches." Unquote. He wasn't kidding. Marvin seemed to think a lot more about women than he did about basketball that rookie season. One night, Marvin spent an entire pregame warm-up talking to a lady in the stands rather than stretching or doing layups. He just lived in his own world, completely detached from any responsibilities. Women and cars, that's all he seemed to care about. His favorite car he owned was his Rolls Royce, as he could often be seen driving down the streets of St. Louis in a wide-brimmed hat and a long mink coat. The ice cream parlor was his favorite spot to drive to, and oftentimes, he would pick up any kids he saw standing in the street to take them to get ice cream too. The Rolls Royce was also the car he would have ball boys go out and wash before games, rather than, doing their job. In a game against the Memphis Sounds, Bob Costas was late because he had wanted to cash his check earlier in the day when the rest of the team was flying to Memphis. He was so late, in fact, that he could actually hear the game he was supposed to be announcing on the radio of the cab he was taking from the airport to the arena. Sure that he was going to get fired, he told his sob story to the Spirits players. Marvin said, "Hey bro, don't worry about it. I've been looking for a little white dude to drive me around in my Rolls Royce." He even promised to give Costas a chauffeur cap. In Marvin's first ever preseason game, one of his girlfriends called him on the phone to tell him that she had totaled his brand new Cadillac. Distraught, Marvin only scored 6 points in what was probably the most torturous game of upper management's life, seeing as how they had spent $2.1 million on this kid. Around the same time during training camp, Marvin came into practice late and blamed his tardiness on the fact that he lost his Bentley in a parking lot. According to his teammate Gene Littles, there weren't more than 3 Bentleys in all of St. Louis at the time, so how Marvin couldn't find the car is beyond me. And then there was another car he had bought for his girlfriend, a Buick. One day, when Marvin was running late to catch a team flight, he drove to the airport in the Buick, and once he stepped out of the car, he tossed the keys to someone he thought was a porter and told them to park it. Apparently, the guy then got in the Buick and drove off, never to be seen again. Speaking of airports, now we arrive at the most infamous Marvin Barnes story. A story so ludicrous, it's become the stuff of legends in the annals of basketball history. It took place in Louisville, Kentucky, when the Spirits had to catch an 8 a.m. flight back to St. Louis. It was only an hour-long flight, but when Marvin got his plane ticket, something didn't quite sit right with him. The departure time read 8 a.m., but the arrival time was 7:59 a.m. Unable to wrap his mind around the concept that Louisville and St. Louis were in 2 different time zones, Marvin just shook his head and announced, "I ain't going on no time machine. I ain't taking no flight that takes you back in time." Yes, he actually said that. But the airport madness doesn't end there. After playing a game in New York, the Spirits then had to fly to Norfolk. Naturally, Marvin wasn't there when he was supposed to be. The owners and coach called Marvin at the hotel he was still sleeping in, only to hear him mumble something about how he would catch a later flight. Well, he missed not 1, not 2, but 3 of the commercial flights to Norfolk. So what did Marvin do? He chartered a private plane to fly him to Norfolk. That might be pretty commonplace now, but in the mid-70s, that was pretty unheard of for a basketball player to do. About 10 minutes before the game in Norfolk was set to start, when the players and coach were going over their strategy, Marvin burst into the Spirits' locker room with bags of McDonald's in his hands. "Boys, game time is on time," he announced as he opened his $10,000 mink coat, like Superman, to reveal his Spirits uniform that he was wearing underneath. But the story doesn't end there. When the actual game was being played, the pilot that had flown Marvin marched angrily over to the Spirits bench and began demanding that he be paid. So while the rest of the team was drawing up a play in the huddle during a timeout, Marvin could be seen hunched over at the end of the bench, writing a check. It just went on and on. He would disappear for entire travel days, get yelled at, and fined, but not suspended. Rinse and repeat. Marvin just didn't see the use in going to practice, preferring to save his energy for the games. The Spirits began fining him $1 for every minute he was late to practice. When that didn't work, they raised it to $5, then $10, even $50 a minute. It really upset Marvin that they kept taking his money. Upset enough to change his ways? Well, no. Instead, he just complained to his teammate, Pogo Joe Caldwell, a 2-time All-Star with the Hawks in the NBA and later the Carolina Cougars. Apparently, Caldwell was the guy who had suggested to the Spirits front office that they should fine Marvin for being late, but at the same time, he would turn around and tell Marvin that the franchise was lowballing him with his contract, and that he should look for greener pastures. This led to a pretty notorious moment for the franchise when, on November 20th, 1974, before the team was scheduled to play a game against the New York Nets, Barnes checked out of his hotel and had Caldwell drive him to the airport, where he promptly disappeared for days until he was eventually found in a smoky pool hall in Dayton, Ohio, where he was meeting a new potential player agent. The incident led to Caldwell getting suspended from the team and essentially blackballed from basketball for the rest of his life. Regardless of whatever Caldwell's intentions may have been, Bob Costas summed up the situation the best anyone ever could. Quote, "The Spirits claimed that Joe Caldwell had led Marvin Barnes astray. Believe me, Marvin spent much of his life astray. He didn't need a map or someone else to take him there." Unquote. Now, we've spent the last couple of minutes laughing at Marvin's quirks. But when it came time to play, let's not get our words twisted here. He was nothing short of incredible that first year. Despite the constant partying, lack of sleep, and poor conditioning, Marvin averaged 24 points and 15.6 rebounds with what Harry Weltman described as the worst shot selection I had ever seen on a pro player. To illustrate that point, I'm going to recount one of Marvin's more egregious shots to paint a picture. On a wide open break, Barnes caught the ball and only had to take a few steps to either dunk or lay it in. But instead of doing that, he decided to take 3 steps backwards and attempt a three-pointer in 1975. Despite his clear lack of discipline, Marvin's reflexes were just too fast for the rest of the league. Remember that game where he got himself benched for talking to a girl instead of warming up? Well, in that same game, Marvin went on to score 40 points and grab at least 20 rebounds. He could hit just about any mid-range shot and was a strong finisher inside. But he just could not pass, which was a general theme among the rest of the Spirits players those first couple of games. Despite their good individual talent, they just couldn't play as a team. Case in point, on October 29th, 1974, the Spirits lost a squeaker to San Diego, 109-110. Marvin scored 48 points and had 30 rebounds, and after the game, he came to Bob Costas to voice his grievances. He knew that the team had a lack of cohesion, but the example he used to illustrate this was to complain that nobody passed him the ball towards the end of the game so that he could have 50 points for the night instead of 48. So much for team play, I guess. It was only after the Spirits acquired former Pacers champion and playoff MVP, Freddie Lewis, as well as a few decent veteran role players that things began to change. Lewis really whipped the team into shape that first season, as evidenced by the fact that he was the only Spirits player to earn an All-Star selection besides Marvin, who also won Rookie of the Year over future Hall of Famers Bobby Jones and Moses Malone. The team finished 32-52, which was good enough to earn a playoff spot, but they were matching up against the first-seeded New York Nets, led by Dr. J. Julius Erving, in the first round. A team that had destroyed them in all 11 matchups during the regular season, and then a 12th time in Game 1 of the Eastern Division semifinals, 111-105. It seemed like the series was over before it even started, but miraculously, the Spirits pulled themselves together and won the next 4 games straight to eliminate the Nets in advance. Marvin was stellar, averaging 30 and 16 over the course of the series, but the hero of Game 5 was Freddie Lewis, who scored the final 10 straight points of the game, including a 20-foot buzzer beater to win 108-107. Unfortunately for the Spirits, any momentum they had going into the East Finals versus the eventual champion Kentucky Colonels disappeared when Lewis went down with a sprained ankle. Marvin still played good, but the Spirits were defeated in 5 games. While hopes were high going into the 75-76 season, reality soon came crashing down for the Spirits. First, it was the loss of Coach McKinnon and Steve Jones, then it was newcomer and former champion Don Chaney getting injured and missing a good chunk of the season, and finally Marvin just continued to be Marvin. It was this season where he began to develop an addiction to drugs, the really bad kind, which led to him doing scary things like bringing a 9mm gun into the team locker room and then proceed to point it at people and laugh. Someone who became really fed up with Marvin's behavior was second-year player Maurice Lucas. Lucas was very serious about the game, and he had blossomed into a starting forward for the Spirits. You could almost say he was the exact opposite of Marvin. He began to complain to the front office about Marvin's behavior, essentially forcing the team to choose between either him or Marvin. In the end, Lucas got traded to the Colonels, while Marvin got to stay. To add on to the misery, the coach the Spirits had replaced McKinnon with, Rod Thorne, was replaced by Joe Mulaney mid-season, and Marvin drove Mulaney absolutely crazy. So much so that Mulaney would reportedly whisper, "He's killing me, he's killing me, he's killing me," to himself constantly while he was sitting on the bench during games. It was also during Marvin's second year that Larry Kadvertis dropped a $1.2 million lawsuit against Marvin for hitting him in the head with a tire iron. Marvin was still able to make the All-Star game with similar averages to his rookie year, but it was overall just a rough year for the Spirits, which ultimately ended with the team missing the playoffs with a 35-49 record. Unfortunately for Marvin, that's pretty much where his relevancy as a basketball player ends. He would continue to play in the NBA for 4 more years after the NBA-ABA merger, but all of those missed practices caught up to him fast. Other than a few odd performances here and there, he was never able to replicate the level of dominance he had shown in his first 2 All-Star seasons. Remember how I said he was placed on probation for the attack on Larry Kadvertis in college? Well, in 1976, as a member of the Detroit Pistons, he violated that probation by bringing a .38 revolver and 5 stray bullets to the Detroit Metro Airport, which led to him serving 152 days in a Rhode Island penitentiary. As a member of the Boston Celtics during the 78-79 season, he snorted cocaine while he was sitting next to Nate Tiny Archibald on the bench during an active game. His teammates moved away from him fast, and they continued to distance themselves from him for the rest of the season. Drug use continued to be a problem for Marvin, who was out of the NBA before he was 28. He had spent his entire career earnings of $4 million, and with no one else willing to hire him, he spent several years homeless and in and out of jail. While he was able to clean up his act for several years, addiction eventually reared its ugly head, and Marvin relapsed, which caused him to die on the morning of September 8th, 2014. A sad ending to his life. I hope he's been able to find peace, wherever he is. Well, that was kind of a bring-down bummer. If you want something that'll make you laugh, check out this other video I have about another gun-obsessed NBA player. I hope you have a good day. Take care.